Meejin Yoon is the Gale and Ira Drukier Dean of the College of Architectural Art and Planning. She's an alumna of the architecture program and recently rejoined Cornell in January 2019 from MIT, where she taught for 18 years and served as head of the Department of Architecture from 2014 to 2018. Meejin is an award-winning and innovative architect, urban designer, and educator. She brings an interdisciplinary spirit to AAP and sees the agency that artists and designers bring as unique to our disciplines and critical to addressing the complex challenges we face as we reimagine our built environment. Please help me welcome Dean Yoon.
Thank you so much, Enrique. The work was really powerful and beautiful. So I think as we approach the end of 2020, it's clearer than ever that this was the first year of a decade that will need to be a decade of action. One that's going to require all of our collective imagination, intelligence, and expertise to design for change. And I wanted to use this talk this afternoon to take stock of the state of design today and think about how design can and will shape our future. Design is, of course, by definition about future making. It's projective and it's anticipatory, and arguably any act of design is an act of speculation. And it is always about an uncertain future. If we take this opportunity to examine the conditions and questions designers are grappling with today, we may have hints as to the answers about the future. As shared by science fiction writer William Gibson, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. So in order to peer into the future, we need only to look deeply into our present. And oftentimes the future is tucked away in our studios and labs on our campuses. The university is not only a place that has insights into the future, but it has an important role and responsibility in prototyping that future. My own design work and research moves between the studio, the lab, and the city, and is focused on public spaces, both in terms of the formal organization and the informal behaviors they engender. And specifically, the role of technologies in design, experience, and making is what I focus on, specifically the development and creation of publicness and public space. From interactive architectures and computation to create environmentally responsive structures to robotic fabrication, my work examines the limits, constraints, and opportunities of design technologies and how these technologies might scale to the scale of buildings and ultimately to the scale of cities. Our present moment is characterized simultaneously by a superabundance of information and digital connectivity, and simultaneously a continued lack of certainty. In fact, our age of information and big data coincides with the age of post-truth and an erosion of trust. According to German engineer and economist Klaus Schwab, we're in the midst of a fourth industrial revolution, an age of rapid societal transformation at the global scale, transformed by science and engineering, from mapping the human genome to robotics and additive manufacturing to machine learning and artificial intelligence. These technologies are enabling us to, on one hand, solve extremely complex problems, but they're also rapidly changing the way we create, exchange, and distribute value. Facing a paradox between accelerated technological progress on one hand and the daunting public health and environmental challenges on the other, designers are asking simple questions with complicated answers, most often beginning with what can we do and how can design better serve the world? How do we use design to think through the biggest design challenges of our time? Ava Horn presents us with one model. In her book, The Future as Catastrophe, she gives us multiple scenarios for speculating about the end of the world, the Cold War, global warming, sea level rise. Examining these scenarios for catastrophe as a model for how we can think about design in the face of disasters, she offers a framework to think through design as alternative futures. So I've been using the term design quite a bit, and it may be useful to unpack the definition. Everyone has an idea of what design means, and it's often associated with aesthetics or style. But when I think about design, I think about the ability to imagine and affect change. Design as a catalyst, design as an active transformation for how we live, interact, and engage with each other and our world. Among designers who expanded the definition of design were Charles and Ray Eames, who so elegantly in their film, The Powers of 10, examined the relative scale of things from the microscopic to the macroscopic across science through design. And maybe another more contemporary example of design across scales might be Apple. We used to, for my generation, think of Apple as a computer company. Through a redesign of their own powers of 10, they went from designing computers to redesigning the whole user experience between communication, information, and media. And they created a whole design ecology of objects, interfaces, experiences, and services. They leverage design across scales, and they also are designing more than functional objects. They're designing demand. So design has never had the status it has today. The proliferation of the term in business schools and engineering programs are indicators of this status. But in my opinion, design is as much an art as it is a science. It's nonlinear. It requires expansive analysis of constraints and opportunities, but it also requires a high level of discernment, synthesis, and aspiration. And thus, design is more a searching than a solving. It's more an inquiry than a methodology. I think one of the best definitions of design I've heard is from Herbert Simon, who was a political scientist and early framer of the field of artificial intelligence. In '69, he said, if science is concerned with the world as it is, then design is concerned with how things ought to be. It's this oughtness, the world as it ought to be, that articulates the goal of design, which is an inquiry into our deepest human values and aspirations. If design requires imagination, then how do we image the world, and how we image the world matters. The famous image of the blue marble, the first clear image of the Earth beautifully illuminated by Apollo 17, taken by Apollo 17 in 1972, allowed us to see for the first time the Earth in both its fullness and its vulnerability. The image awakened an environmental consciousness that would lead to the global environmental movement of the 70s. Today's image of the world might be closer to the black marble, seen from space with cities illuminating continents and tracing their edges. Here you do not see the cloud formations, but instead the presence of human habitation and night. And for many, this image makes visible the Anthropocene, the era characterized by the human impact on the Earth's ecosystem. Our globe is littered with satellites and sensors collecting data and allowing us to see and image the planet in new ways, making visible the invisible. And climate, as opposed to weather, is not something you can perceive. Climate is the sum total of weather phenomena, its averages, its patterns, its trends. It's a statistical condition. We cannot truly design for climate change without leveraging these massive amounts of data. So what does this data show? This representation shows the impacts of climate, 100-year storms happening more intensely with devastating impacts on communities and cities. Can we design our way out of these catastrophes? Could these catastrophes be avoided? Increasingly, we see that these catastrophes are not force majeure, but a combination of bad design decisions and severe weather events. Here we see a flood map of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, which makes quite evident that the hurricane was not just a natural disaster, but a man-made one as well, where poor design decisions from land use patterns to failed infrastructure had a catastrophic impact on the city. When Katrina made landfall in 2005, the storm surges caused a failure of over 50 levees, submerged 80% of the city, and led to approximately 1,800 fatalities and the loss of 125 billion in property. This was a feature that did not need to happen. It was not only predicted 40 years earlier, but it was directly experienced in 1965. Hurricane Betsy devastated the same region. The storm killed over 70 people. It was the first hurricane to cause over $1 billion worth of damage. The images are eerily similar, making evident the failure of design and politics to learn from the past, to learn from its past mistakes and propose better design solutions for tomorrow. If we zoom out a little further, we understand better the relationship between the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico. On the left, we see this extraordinary map by the Army Corps of Engineers, which records the movement of the Mississippi. And it was actually through the hardening of the Mississippi with dams and levee to control the adjacent flooding that contributed to the reduction of the wetlands that historically provided a natural buffer to the hurricanes along the Gulf. And on the right, you can see an array of orange lines and red lines. And what you're seeing is the vast network of oil pipelines, making evident the potential magnitude of the next man-made ecological disaster of the region. This is an image of New York after Hurricane Sandy. Highlights the vulnerability of even our greatest cities, where a Category 4 storm knocked out power to Lower Manhattan. We often hear the terms sustainability, resilience, and adaptation used interchangeably, but I think it's important to understand the nuances between them. Sustainability suggests that the goal is to sustain a recent or near recent condition. Resiliency implies a kind of bounce back, literally. And adaptation, on the other hand, asks, should we really be striving to bounce back, or should we be adapting and changing in new ways? Hurricane Sandy was a kind of wake-up call for designers, and it precipitated all kinds of government and institutional programs to rethink coastal design, including the Rebuild by Design competition sponsored by HUD. And one of the most interesting projects I think that came out of that was Living Breakwaters by landscape architect Kate Orff, who overlaid coastal resiliency infrastructure with habitat enhancement techniques to buffer neighborhoods from wave damage by both thickening and softening the edges with habitat for oysters and other organisms, essentially creating a kind of living breakwater infrastructure. And this proposal was awarded $60 million in funding and is currently being implemented. So I think this project demonstrates that the future of sustainability may be more brown than green and more soft than hard as we look at adapting our coastal cities to sea level rise. The other thing we know is that the impacts of climate change will not be evenly distributed. Professor Linda Shai from Cornell City Regional Planning looks at coastal conditions here in the San Francisco Bay Area, where different communities are battling sea level rise independently, at times creating local solutions that have the cumulative effect of creating more disastrous sea level rise impacts on neighboring communities, exacerbating the unequal vulnerability between those that can afford resilient strategies and those that cannot. Students in her climate adaptation workshop project how one town will experience infrastructural, social, and fiscal vulnerability from sea level rise, helping to create awareness among public policymakers about the need for regional collective action to mitigate local impacts. Climate change is, of course, not only a problem here in the US, but around the world. Drought, famine, flooding, and disease are just a few of the many secondary effects of climate change, all of which result in the migration of people from places around the world that are no longer sustainable or habitable. While migration is not a new phenomenon, it's steadily growing. In 2018, 17.2 million people were forced to abandon their homes due to disaster. And this number is expected to rise to above 22 million this year. In sum total, migration has reached a record high. The UN reports that there are nearly 71 million persons of concern. 26 million to 29 million people are considered refugees. 41 million are displaced within their home countries, and more than 35,000 people were forced to flee their homes every day in 2018. That's nearly one person every 2 seconds. One of the greatest design challenges with migration is the precarity of human settlement. Refugee camps are temporarily and provisionally by mandate, and despite the fact that many refugees stay in these camps for an average of 12 to 20 years, due to policies, these camps cannot provide more permanent shelter or infrastructure. The resulting condition is essentially a permanent condition of temporary encampment. Due to the number of displaced people who move to cities for better access to resources, the importance of thinking of migration as an urban design and policy design problem is crucial. If the current growth rate of cities is maintained, then 6 billion people will be living in cities by 2040, with a quarter of that population living in informal settlements. Designers, planners, and governments will need to rethink access and provision of basic services at unprecedented scales. Cornell professor Victoria Beard's research with the World Resources Institute examines challenges facing many rapidly urbanizing cities, which have fewer resources to deliver core services, clean water being among the most critical resources for people everywhere. Her research on the feasibility of piped water versus trucked water points to not only the importance of access, but finds that relying on self-provisioning for water, whether from groundwater supply or trucked water, is not only unsustainable, but insecure, with little assurance of safety, reliability, and cost. Furthermore, the number of cities facing extreme risks from climate change are astounding. Some 84 of the world's 100 fastest growing cities will face layered challenges from rising temperatures and sea level rise. By 2030, the world is projected to have 43 megacities with more than 10 million inhabitants, much of them in developing regions. Many countries will face challenges meeting the needs of their growing urban populations. While rapidly urbanizing cities are both our greatest design challenge, they're also our best opportunity for tackling design of climate at scale. How we design and build our cities will have a significant global consequence. Essentially, 1/3 of CO2 emissions comes from the transportation sector, and the other third comes from the construction sector, and both are inextricably intertwined with how we design and think about buildings and our cities. As you may know, buildings are extremely resource intensive. And while the building and architecture industries have focused on performance to achieve green standards, the operation of a building represents only 20% of the energy consumed in the full life cycle of a building. The material ecology of a building, from resources extracted to manufacturing to construction, to its demolition and eventual resting home is where the greater portion of energy is consumed and carbon emissions is produced. Maybe I could illustrate this complexity of supply chain and energy consumption for a very simple design object like an aluminum Coke can. Iron ore is mined in Australia, then it's smelted and it consumes 51% of the total energy to yield a quarter of the mine mass of the ore. Then it's shipped to Sweden, where it's hot rolled, it's cold rolled in Germany, it's then stamped in England, it's washed in France, then it's shipped to the United States, and it's stocked in 2.8 million vending machines or stores, and then it's consumed in a few minutes and then tossed in a landfill. And we could also do this for a building. Like here we see Kyle Moe, professor at McGill University, who traces the material flows of all the materials used to build the Empire State's Building and the distances traveled. Buildings have thousands of components, each with their own global supply chain. Concrete is the second most used material on Earth, only second to water. It's the most widely used construction material in the world, but it's also the most environmentally damaging. The manufacturing of concrete alone is responsible for 5% of global carbon dioxide emissions, and it's a material that cannot be easily recycled. Yet, it's the preferred material of choice in the rapidly urbanizing world. Many architects and engineers are researching ways to make concrete more sustainable. Another area of innovation and sustainable construction is in the area of mass timber. Wood is a rapidly renewable material when paired with sustainable growing practices. And here we see Lisa Gray's research at Timber City, which explores the environmental efficacy of mass timber construction technologies. The emergence of mass timber uses solid and composite woods, which are assembled together to create more structural integrity. And researchers speculate that one could build out of mass timber buildings that are 30 to 40 stories tall. And while that goes against our conventional wisdom, because wood is a combustible material, timber at a certain mass actually produces its own fire retardant behavior. Interestingly, the construction and the building industry remains one of the most archaic industries. One of the foundational principles of industrial construction is the standardization of parts. However, standardization, like the creation of your standard 2x4, results in a significant amount of material waste. And while other industries have increased productivity exponentially through the use of automation and robotics, building construction remains the least digitized sector with a productivity gap of $1.6 trillion. One area of technological advancement that we're beginning to see in construction is the robotic assembly and fabrication, from drones that stack modules to large-scale robotic arms in situ. This is a project that I wanted to introduce called the Corbel Cabin, recently completed by Professor Sasha Zivkovich and Leslie Locke at Cornell's Robotic Construction Lab. The project responds to the local condition of the emerald ash borer that has infected ash trees across the Northeast and actually across the United States. Professor Zivkovich and Locke use these diseased trees not only as building material, but they work with the uniqueness of each of these diseased trees. And they've developed a tool that processes irregular timber stock that allows the robotic arm to carve irregular pieces of lumber that would normally not be possible if they had to work with industrialized standard timber manufacturing processes. So here you can see this unique piece of diseased ash tree, which wouldn't be able to be used otherwise, being carved by this robotic arm to be used as cladding on a concept cabin here, which also used 3D printed concrete for its foundations. Images like this force us to think about material use and reuse. As mentioned before, the foundational principles of industrial construction is the standardization of materials. However, after a building is built, its materials become non-standard, challenging their reuse. Yet, recycling and upcycling materials are key to reducing CO2 emissions. Andrew Witt's work, he's a faculty member at Harvard GSD, shows in this digital landfill project how one could respond to the afterlife of a house. So this house was scheduled to be demolished. Leveraging computational power, each of the components was then cataloged, measured, and entered into a machine learning algorithm, which resorted all the elements to populate new forms out of this old material, essentially using waste to create new forms. Architects are thinking more about embodied energy, more about material procurement, and more about the full life cycle of a building as they make design decisions. Professor Felix Heisel here at AAP Circular Construction Lab is researching how to create a paradigm shift from linear material consumption towards a circular economy within industrialized construction industries. He's developed a new tool that enables the tracking of building components to help us better understand embodied energy. And here we see an urban scale material stock inventory measuring the circularity on both buildings and a regional level. I think this work is really exciting for where it will take the industry. So as we project into the future, if the last age was the age of industrialization and physics, we now have entered into an age, I think, of biology, where many designers are looking at nature in new ways to radically rethink our building blocks, quite literally. From organic materials like mushrooms and asking how the material can be grown, processed, compressed to make new compostable bricks. This is a project by David Benjamin at Columbia, or to the work of Neri Oxman at MIT, who's researching chitin, which is found in shells, as material that can be 3D printed into new structures, to even partnering and co-creating with nature, here with silkworms to weave a silk pavilion. Not all of biology, as we know, is collaborative, and we're just beginning to understand the complex biology powering the coronavirus pandemic. Scientists have learned that the virus has evolved an array of adaptations that make it more lethal than any other coronavirus humanity has met so far. COVID-19 is our first pandemic of the jet age, where our physical interconnectedness via planes, trains, subways circulated the virus rapidly across countries, territories, and regions. But it's also the first pandemic of the fourth industrialization, where data science, genomics, rapid prototyping, distributed manufacturing, and machine learning are contributing to research and vaccine development at speeds previously unheard of. It's also created a culture of collaboration and interdisciplinary innovation in science, engineering, and design that we've never seen before. Here at Cornell, Professor Jenny Sabin in the Department of Architecture, along with Professor Kirsten Peterson in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and Professor Amy Kusieski of mathematics at Weill Cornell Medicine responded to a call by Dr. James Shin at Weill Cornell Medicine, and asked, and they stood up what they called Operation PPE, and utilized their distributed network of rapid prototyping 3D printers across campus and through our network of alumni and industry to fill a desperate need for PPE in the early days of the pandemic, putting to use over thousands of individual 3D printers. The spirit of interdisciplinary collaboration and mutual aid to develop solutions quickly through a distributed network led to further collaborations across institutions and the country, where architects, industrial designers, engineers, and doctors were working together to design everything from masks to non-rebreathers to patient isolation hoods. That spirit of collaboration has continued today, and in Professor Sabin's class, Designing and Making Across Disciplines in COVID-19, the students are looking at methods that are emerging through new technologies across design and engineering and science to synthetically think and make design solutions in response to COVID-19. And here's an example from Sabin's lab at Cornell in collaboration with Black Box at Princeton for a fabric harness, which allows individuals to turn any available piece of fabric into a custom fitted mask with this flexible face frame. I think it's really, really brilliant. So sometimes in order to design the future, we have to look long and hard at our past. And I'd like to conclude the lecture this evening by sharing the story of a memorial at the University of Virginia. This is a project that I've been really humbled to work on with an incredible design team of collaborators, Mabel Wilson, Frank Dukes, Greg Bleem, Eto Tutigbe, and Eric Howler over the past 4 years. But the story begins over 400 years ago, when an estimated 430,000 men, women, and children were kidnapped and trafficked from Africa to the Caribbean to the American colonial South. They were forced to labor to support an economy that was based on agricultural production of cotton and tobacco. Founded by Thomas Jefferson, the University of Virginia holds a special place in American history. And the grounds and the academical village are on one hand associated with the ideals of democracy, yet its foundations were literally built by slavery. As you can see from this historical marker, there's no mention of that in the standard history of the university. So the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers endeavors to tell the story of the estimated 4,000 men, women, and children who built, worked, and lived at the university from its founding in 1817 to the end of the Civil War. Here we see a historic print from 1830 of the lawn and the academical village. And if we look real closely, we can see a woman taking care of a child in one of the pavilions. This is one of the oldest representations we have of slavery at the university. And it's a history that was hidden in plain sight for 155 years. And this hidden history is embedded in the university's landscape and its architecture. So while we think of Jefferson as the architect of UVA, it was the enslaved workers, many young boys, who did the backbreaking labor of digging the clay, filling the molds, and firing the bricks. We can even see traces of their fingerprints on the bricks, like these at Monticello. So our design challenge was to make other materials speak and to develop methods to remember this community of individuals and fellow friends and family and workers, and to revive their humanity while never forgetting the dehumanizing violence of slavery. So over the course of about 6 months to a year, we engaged multiple stakeholders. We went from classrooms to local schools to churches. We spoke to community members and to members of the descendant community. And we didn't ask them what the memorial should look like, but we asked them what kind of meaning the memorial should have. And it became really clear through that engagement process for the memorial to have both meaning and relevance. It had to, of course, honor the lives of the enslaved, but it also had to advance the commemorative landscape for racial justice today. So in our conversations, what we heard was that the memorial would need to tell the unvarnished truth of the past to have any legitimacy, that it needed to bring the community together to both learn and reflect on that history, that it needed to express dualities, not only of pain and suffering, but also resilience, dignity, and humanity. And lastly, it needed to be a living memorial and an ongoing memorial to acknowledge the work of this history that it remains incomplete. So in order to design the project, we develop a design process to make the process very open and to foreground dialogue. And we develop a series of different design approaches. And what emerged was a consensus that, in contrast to many monuments that stand as an object in space, the memorial for enslaved laborers needed to be a space for the people of the present to recognize and reconcile the present with the legacy of the past. So as part of the design process, we also looked at cultural forms and rituals that could be translated into our design, from the ring shout, a low country ecstatic dance, which comes from West African practices, to hush harbors, which were clearings in the woods for the enslaved to gather in safety, and then also water, which became a means to tell the story of liberation and was found in libation rituals. We also heard the memorial had to forge a connection with the community and participate in a local commemorative landscape, that of Freedom Day, which occurs on March 3rd every year and remembers the day the Union troops liberated the 14,000 enslaved people in the region. And here is a community gathering on what would become the site of the memorial the following year, gathered together on Freedom Day with the simple gesture of coming together in a circle. So the memorial is sited in dialogue with the rotunda, which sits at the highest point of the lawn, which Jefferson placed on that hill. And he also carefully terraced the lawn in section, which allowed Jefferson's pavilions to be 2 stories when facing into the lawn, but 3 stories on what was called the garden side, which created a lower walkout basement level, which actually housed the spaces and work yards for the enslaved labor. The spaces behind these pavilions were hidden by the famous serpentine walls, and Jefferson understood slavery to be abhorrent and employed architecture and the architectural section in order to conceal it. The memorial's architecture, in contrast then to those strategies, works to reveal and open and invite. So in contrast to the rotunda, which is a closed sphere, the memorial is an open bowl-like figure. They're both 80 feet in diameter. So the memorial's nestled into a slope terrain called the Triangle of Grass, which sits within the UNESCO World Heritage Site boundaries of the university. And it doesn't sit on axis, but it actually sits tangent along a diagonal path between the University Avenue and Academical Village. And the determining geometries consist of two cones that intersect slightly off axis. And this intersection creates a circle, a crescent, a ring, and they're all symbols for many things that intentionally hold a multitude of meanings and references: a hollow, a void, a ring shout, a gesture that's open to interpretation. And the conical intersection creates a series of nested rings, which offer multiple layers that unfold the stories of the enslaved. The center holds a gathering space, which is inscribed by an inner ring, which holds a timeline of historic events. The next layer of the ring, which is a concave surface of remembrance, and then the outer convex surface creates the kind of canvas for expression. And each of these rings speaks to a different layer of history. The memorial itself is just made out of one material, a Virginia Miss local granite. And the goal was to use the full range of this stone to enable it to speak in many ways through its textures and its carvings. Because the enslaved were considered property, while there was careful, meticulous accounting of their labor, their identities were largely unknown. We work closely with a group of committed historians who examine the archives and the ledgers and the personal letters of slave owners to unveil the daily life, labor, and violence of the community. Historians estimate that approximately 4,000 men and women and children built, labored, and lived at UVA. But we know very little detail. For most of the names, for 3,111 persons to be exact, the archives do not record a first name or even a last name. Records for about 889 persons record some aspect of their identity. And we know sometimes just a portion, a first name or a last name. And for the remaining 311 recorded persons, we have a sense of only kinship relationships and occupations. So the result of this research yielded the design of a genealogical cloud of this community, which consists of 4,000 memory marks, is what we call them, which are lines and that are carved into the stone to recognize each individual. And as you walk around the memorial, you become enveloped by this cloud of names, marks, and relationships. And the list of names rehumanizes the experience of the enslaved between the names and the kinship and the skills that they had. And the marks themselves are a kind of gesture of an arc, which gashes into the stone. And because it goes deep into the stone, it holds water a little bit longer after it rains. So the flat surfaces dry rather quickly, but as the rain water seeps out of these memory marks, it makes the stone appear to cry, weep, or bleed in memory of the enslaved. And in contrast to the wall of marks and names is a lower level water table, which shows the history of enslavement at the university. And it's positioned just below the knees. So visitors have to lean in almost in a kind of bowing posture to read the names, to read the timeline. There's 70 entries that are inscribed into this water table timeline, beginning with the arrival of the enslaved in 1619, and it ends with the passing of Isabella Gibbons in 1890. It covers the arrival of the 10 enslaved laborers who cleared the land that would eventually become UVA in 1817. And it covers a history of transactions, work, and violence. And I wanted to read just a few samples of the entries. 1820 to 22, Sam works for 2 years at the university as a blacksmith. 1832, 3 professors purchase Lewis Commodore at public auction for the school's use. They are later reimbursed and he becomes UVA property. In 1856, an enslaved 11-year-old girl is beaten unconscious by a UVA student. Claiming his right to discipline any slave, he suffers no consequences. The succinct, matter-of-fact tone of the timeline entries paints the difficult and unvarnished history of the life and violence of slavery with poignancy. And then a steady stream of shallow water washes over the entire arc of the timeline. We had the great fortune to work with Eto Otutigbe, who was the artist on our team. And here you see a self-portrait of his titled Becoming Visible. And he pays homage to Trayvon Martin using a technique of carving inspired by traditional carvings and bronze statues from West Africa. And so as a team, we really found Isabella Gibbons to become the protagonist of the memorial. She's one of the few for whom we have a full name, a date of death, and a photograph, and a brief written record of her experience. And she operated on the spectrum of resistance as someone who taught herself and others to read and write while they were enslaved. She was witness to the freedom and liberation, and she became a teacher in the Freedmen's School until her death. And in so many ways, she exemplifies the spirit of triumph over despair. Can we forget the crack of the whip, the cowhide, the whipping post, the auction block, the handcuffs, the spaniels, the iron collar, the Negro trader tearing the young child from its mother's breast as a whelp from a lioness? Have we forgotten that by these horrible cruelties, hundreds of our race have been killed? No, we will not. No, we have not, nor ever will. And this is the way the timeline is concluded. So Eto and the community really wanted to use her portrait on the exterior of the memorial. And so her eyes were blown up to a kind of colossal scale so that she could become the watcher and the witness of the memorial. And during the design and fabrication phase, we worked with Chorus Stone in Wisconsin. With them, we developed parametric carving techniques using rhino and grasshopper that would allow us to ensure that the eyes would become legible and visible at very specific vantage points. So this took a lot of careful coordination and precision. And here you can see the eyes at a colossal scale. So the memorial has become a new horizon line on the campus. Its exterior surface is overlaid with this gouge pattern, which highlights these dualities, the pain and violence, and then the dignity and humanity, and the many layers of meaning that come from the whole. The landform quality of the concave and the convex meeting in a way that communicates something that maybe we're all still struggling to find the words. And the memorial is a living, ongoing memorial, and it's incomplete. So when new names come to light through historian research or genealogical research, we add them to the memorial. And during the process of the memorial construction, it was incredible that several additional names were discovered. And lastly, the memorial's dedication did not happen in the spring as planned due to COVID. But what happened was as the construction fence was removed from the site, doctors, nurses, and students from the medical school were joined by the broader community in memorial service organized by White Coats for Black Lives in remembrance of the murder of George Floyd. And the community took a knee for 8 minutes and 40 seconds as a reminder of the past violence and injustices that persist in the wake of slavery. So the Memorial for Enslaved Laborers at UVA came into fruition through this kind of collective desire to face the past, to reckon with truths, and to advance a better and more just future. Thank you.
I'll be sharing your questions for Dean Yoon this evening. So Dean Yoon, what is your vision for the role of technology in the design process of the future? How do you see education needing to change as a result?
So one of the things I think is really special about Cornell is like we spanned in the college from super analog technologies, let's say, to maybe the most emerging new technologies. I think that's really important. I think that technology is merely a tool to enable design vision, and we need to be comfortable with these tools, just like we were comfortable with X-Acto knives and May lines of yesteryear. And I think that the technologies are not going to solve our problems, that it's actually through interdisciplinary expertise and vision that we'll be able to use the full capacity of our technologies available to us to endeavor to design a better future.
What do you think will be the most lasting impact of the pandemic on design?
I think it's too early to tell. I think, the impact on cities will be quite significant, and it will probably take a while for us to understand the true fragility or strain that our cities are under. But I think similar to Hurricane Sandy, I think it'll be a wake-up call for all designers, architects, engineers, policy makers, planners, to really rethink how we build our cities and communities.
What is it like being a student or professor at AAP in this time of COVID?
It's been incredible to see how resilient everyone is. We have about 2/3 of our students back studying in person at AAP, and about 1/3 who are studying remotely, making it probably the most challenging semester to stand up by both faculty and administrators. But it's incredible to walk through the studios and see still the incredible production of design imagination happening across the college. And even the students have transformed Sibley Beach with a kind of installation of social distancing rockers. And earlier in the week, it was absolutely beautiful, and the students were out on the quad, socially distant, but trying to make the most of this time.
How can architectural education shift to be more inclusive and open?
I think architecture training, at least how I was educated, it was very kind of independent. The work was your creative work. You had one-on-one crits with your studio instructor, and it was solitary in a way. Even though you did get critiques and input, I think that architectural education is going to be more collaborative, that more and more expertise is going to be needed by both the architect, but also it's going to be important to maintain the ability to kind of choreograph and bring together experts to solve more and more complex design and building challenges.
What are some tools you can recommend for articulating the value and importance of design?
You know, I think great design is one of the best ways that great design is communicated. You know, I think that, you know, I have a very expansive definition of design. Like, I don't think design is actually owned by designers. I think there are many kinds of designers, and I think we need to acknowledge that more and more, as opposed to hold things tight as our work. So I think that'll be the first good start, sharing more.
What advice would you give to young people just entering the field or wanting to enter the field?
It's hard because for me, it's I can't imagine my life without design and without architecture. So I guess my advice is that if you are passionate about it, there is great need for your talents and skills and intelligence in the field. So please do join us.
So that brings our program to a close. I want to thank Dean Yoon for her terrific and insightful presentation today. Have a good evening.